Imagine a king at the height of his power, wealth, armies, and a loyal kingdom at his command. But then, one mysterious letter arrives, followed by another and another. Each word inside exposes secrets so dark, so dangerous, that they begin to tear his entire empire apart. Who wrote them? Why were they sent? And how could simple pieces of paper bring a mighty king to his knees? Stay with me till the end to uncover the shocking truth behind these secret letters. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because more unbelievable stories from history are waiting for you. The story begins in the golden halls of a kingdom that, on the surface, looked unshakable. Its king sat on the throne draped in velvet and crowned with gold, adored in public ceremonies, painted into portraits as a symbol of power and stability. Yet, behind the polished walls of the palace and beyond the grand feasts, there was a secret that not even the most loyal guards or the most trusted ministers fully understood. This secret did not come in the form of armies or treasonous generals, but in something much smaller, much more letters so carefully written, sealed with wax, and hidden in silk-lined boxes that they seemed harmless. And yet, within these pieces of parchment lay words that would shake the kingdom's foundation, topple reputations, and change the very destiny of the king who once believed himself untouchable. But let's go back to the beginning, because the tale of these letters starts not in the throne room but in the quiet corners of the palace, where whispers often carried more weight than the loudest proclamations. The king, though powerful in title, was not as secure as he seemed. His rule was marred by fragile alliances, jealous rivals, and a court that looked more like a stage for deceit than a place of loyalty. Among the glittering courtiers and painted smiles were enemies cloaked as friends, and friends too timid to speak the truth. It was in this world of half-truths and whispered betrayals that the letters were born. The king had always believed that loyalty was bought with gold and honor, but he underestimated the power of secrets. Somewhere within his circle of advisors, a confidant began exchanging correspondence with someone who should never have had access to the king's most intimate thoughts. Historians still debate whether it was an ambitious noblewoman, a foreign diplomat, or even a betrayed servant who first put quill to parchment. But what is certain is that those words, written in secrecy, began weaving a web that would entrap the king. The letters spoke of things never meant for public eyes. Some carried confessions of forbidden desires, painting the king not as a wise leader but as a man plagued by weaknesses. Others hinted at deals made in the dark, agreements with foreign powers that could be seen as treason if they were revealed. Still more carried words of affection, private passions shared with someone whose identity could ruin the king's reputation forever. And every time wax sealed another letter, fate tightened its grip on him. The palace itself, though a fortress of stone, could not keep whispers from seeping through its walls. Servants carried trays and overheard fragments. Guards exchanged glances when deliveries came late at night. Even the scribes who sharpened quills and prepared ink could sense that something was being hidden. But no one dared speak it aloud, for in a kingdom where a single word against the king could mean execution, silence became the safest choice. Yet silence did not stop curiosity. Curiosity only made the letters more dangerous. It is said that the first of these secret letters was discovered not by a spy or a rival, but by sheer accident. A messenger, entrusted to deliver a sealed note under the cover of night, stumbled in the rain and dropped the letter into the mud. By morning, it had been picked up by a palace guard, who handed it over to a superior officer. The words inside were shocking enough to raise alarms, and suddenly the quiet whispers of court began to find sharper edges. Who wrote this letter? Who received it? And why was the king's name entangled in its sentences? What followed was a dangerous game of shadows. Those who held the letters realized their power. In a kingdom where kings ruled by divine right, nothing seemed stronger than a crown, but words fragile, inked on parchment, could strike harder than any sword. Rumors began to circulate in secret gatherings. The king was hiding something. The more the people speculated, the more the letters gained value, for each word they contained had the power to undo him. The king, unaware of how close danger was, continued his reign as though nothing had changed. He walked in ceremonies, accepted tributes, and gave speeches to his people. Yet beneath the crown, he was increasingly restless. His nights grew longer, and his advisors noticed he often stared at the fire, as if expecting it to whisper his downfall. He must have known, on some instinctual level, that his secrets were no longer safe. But denial is a comforting illusion, and the king clung to it desperately. Meanwhile, in the noble courts outside the palace, alliances began shifting. Some nobles, previously too afraid to oppose the king, sensed an opportunity. If these letters could indeed expose him, then they were holding the key to reshaping power in the kingdom. Plots began to form, and families who once bowed their heads now whispered about alternatives. Candidates for the throne who might rise if the king fell. As the letters multiplied, so did the risks. Not all were kept hidden. Some were exchanged in secret taverns between conspirators, while others were read aloud in hushed tones within noble estates. Each time they passed from hand to hand, the king's image dimmed further. The people, though not yet aware of the full truth, began to feel a subtle shift. Their king was no longer untouchable. He was a man who could bleed, a man who could fall. Historians often marvel at how something as fragile as paper could undo something as strong as a kingdom. But in truth, it wasn't the paper itself, it was the truth that clung to it. Every letter carried with it the weight of human weakness, and in an era where kings were meant to be gods on earth, weakness was the greatest sin. The first signs of change came in the court itself. Advisors who once greeted the king warmly began to avoid his gaze. Servants who once bowed deeply now did so with hesitation. Small gestures, barely noticeable, but enough for a keen observer to sense the shift. And the king, though outwardly proud, felt it. It gnawed at him like an invisible wound. Every banquet, every meeting, every night in the grand chamber felt poisoned by suspicion. He ordered investigations. Messengers were questioned, guards were interrogated, and scribes were watched closely. But for every letter seized, another seemed to appear. It was as if the words themselves multiplied in the shadows, refusing to be silenced. And with each new discovery, the king's desperation deepened. By the end of the first year of this silent war, the letters were no longer just whispers, they were threats. Nobles hinted that, unless certain demands were met, they would release what they held. Foreign powers sent subtle messages, reminding the king of promises made in those letters that could now be turned into weapons. Even those closest to him, his family and inner circle, began to wonder what else the letters might reveal. The king was trapped, his crown still glittered, but its weight was heavier than ever before. He could not destroy the letters fast enough, nor could he silence those who carried them. The very walls of his palace, once symbols of security, now felt like a cage closing in. This was only the beginning. For while the letters had already begun to unravel his authority, the true storm had yet to arrive. Somewhere in the shadows, someone waited for the perfect moment to strike. The moment when revealing these letters would not just embarrass the king but shatter him completely. And when that moment came, the fate of the kingdom itself would change forever. The whispers grew louder. What once had been faint murmurs carried only among the daring few in taverns and corridors now began to move like wildfire. The secret letters had become a currency of power, and those who held even a fragment of them guarded it as though it were a priceless jewel. For the king, this meant that every face he saw, every nobleman, every advisor, every soldier was a potential threat. For anyone could have seen the words that should never have been written. It is often said that kings fall, not from great battles or from mighty swords, but from the quiet erosion of trust. And that was precisely what the letters accomplished. With each passing month, the king trusted fewer people. His meals were tasted for poison 3 times before reaching his plate. His chamber doors were locked with triple bolts. His conversations with ministers, once filled with confidence and bold declarations, turned into clipped exchanges peppered with suspicion. The throne itself, once a place of pride, began to feel like a chair of thorns. But paranoia has a cost. The king's growing fear made him lash out at those closest to him. Loyal servants who had dedicated their lives to him were dismissed or punished at the slightest hint of hesitation. Generals who had won wars in his name were suddenly accused of treason. The more he tried to strangle the shadows, the more they slipped through his fingers. For in truth, the letters were no longer merely secret. They had become a weapon, wielded carefully by those who wished to see the king weakened. It began subtly. A noble family, long disgraced by the king's refusal to grant them influence, suddenly found themselves in possession of a letter hinting at his private scandals. Rather than confront him directly, they used it as leverage, pressing for favors. In the court, another noble whispered to foreign ambassadors, hinting that the king's secret dealings might soon be exposed unless certain alliances were secured. With every bargain struck, with every silent nod exchanged in candlelit halls, the kingdom was being reshaped not by decree, not by law, but by the black ink of those cursed letters. The king, sensing his grip slipping, grew desperate. He called 4 secret councils at night, gathering the most loyal of his circle to seek solutions. Some suggested burning every scrap of paper found in the palace. Others urged him to publicly denounce the letters as forgeries, lies concocted by enemies of the crown. But the problem was that too much truth was hidden within them. To deny them outright was dangerous, for too many already knew they were real. And so, the king turned to harsher measures. Suspected courtiers were arrested in the dead of night, dragged from their chambers by soldiers and interrogated under torchlight. Entire households were ruined by suspicion alone. Some were executed, their bodies hung as warnings outside the city gates, but rather than silencing the rumors, this only deepened them. For if the letters were false, why such violence? If they meant nothing, why was the king so afraid? The people began to talk. Not just nobles, not just ministers, but the common folk in marketplaces and fields. They did not know the exact words of the letters, but they knew enough. They knew their king was hiding something grave enough to warrant blood in the streets, and in times of unrest, rumors are more powerful than truth. Stories spread of betrayals, of secret lovers, of foreign plots. Each tale grew more exaggerated, more damning. Until the king's image, once strong and divine, was painted as that of a weak and corrupt man clinging to power. One of the most dangerous shifts came when foreign powers grew bold. Ambassadors from rival kingdoms, who once bowed respectfully in the palace halls, now carried themselves with subtle arrogance. They had heard of the letters, they knew that their mere existence made the king vulnerable. Offers, once politely declined, were now delivered with veiled threats: comply, or risk exposure. The king's nights grew sleepless. He would pace the length of his chamber, firelight flickering across his face, clutching at parchments as though they might burn his hands. He would ask his most trusted advisor, who holds them now, who spreads them, but no one could give him a clear answer. For the truth was, the letters had spread too far. Some were in noble estates, some in foreign courts, some even whispered to be buried within monasteries where monks debated whether to reveal them as sins of the crown. And then came the betrayal that shattered what little peace he had left. A member of his own bloodline, a cousin raised alongside him since childhood, was discovered exchanging letters with an enemy noble. The revelation struck the king harder than any sword could. To be betrayed by strangers was expected, but by family, it was unbearable. Rage consumed him, and he ordered his cousin imprisoned, stripped of title and dignity. Yet even then, the damage was done. For if the king's own kin would wield the letters against him, then who in the kingdom could he trust? It was at this moment, historians say, that the king began to change completely. The man who once strode proudly before his court now avoided their eyes. The king who once inspired loyalty through strength now ruled through fear alone. He became haunted, hollowed by the weight of secrets that refused to die. Some even whispered that his health began to fade, his body withering under the burden of paranoia. His crown seemed heavier, his voice weaker, his very presence dimmer. But his enemies grew stronger. With each passing season, more letters surfaced, each one adding to the mounting pile of evidence that the king was unworthy, corrupt, or weak. Some contained details of affairs that scandalized the moral sensibilities of the time. Others revealed promises of gold and land to foreign lords, promises that betrayed his people. The most devastating, however, were letters that hinted at plans of treason against his own allies. Words so damning that even those loyal to him began to question whether their king had truly betrayed them. The palace became a battlefield without swords. Ministers plotted behind closed doors. Guards whispered in shadows, and servants carried messages like weapons. Every gesture, every glance, every silence could mean betrayal. And the king, caught in the center, spun endlessly in a web he could not untangle. As the letters spread beyond noble circles, the people themselves demanded answers. Crowds gathered in markets, calling for truth. Pamphlets appeared, spreading exaggerated tales of the king's secret sins. Songs were sung in taverns, mocking his weakness. Slowly, the faith of the people, once his greatest shield, began to crumble. But the true blow came when the letters reached the church. The kingdom's spiritual leaders, who had long blessed the king as chosen by divine right, began to question whether he had strayed too far from virtue. Some priests whispered sermons that hinted at corruption in high places. Others suggested that perhaps God himself no longer favored the king. For a monarch who ruled not just by sword but by divine legitimacy, this was more dangerous than any army. And so the stage was set. The king, once at the height of power, now stood on trembling ground. Every decision he made was overshadowed by the letters. Every alliance he sought was poisoned by them. Every word he spoke was measured against the whispers that surrounded him. He had become a prisoner in his own palace, a ruler without true power, chained by ink and parchment. But the storm had not yet fully broken, for in the shadows, a coalition was forming. Nobles, foreign powers, and even members of the clergy were beginning to align. They waited only for the right moment, the perfect opportunity to release the letters in full. Not in whispers, not in fragments, but all at once, a tidal wave of revelation that would drown the king and leave no chance of escape. And so, as the second chapter of this tale draws to its close, the king sat alone in his chamber, clutching a candle that flickered against the darkness. He must have wondered who he could trust, who had betrayed him, and how much longer he could survive. His fate was no longer his own. It was written in the very letters that bore his secrets. Letters that had become more powerful than the crown itself. The storm that had been brewing around the king finally began to take form. For years, the secret letters had been like whispers in the wind, haunting him, shadowing him, poisoning his relationships. But whispers, when repeated often enough, grow into undeniable truths. And in this part of the story, those truths began to strike with devastating force. The king had tried everything to contain the danger. He had imprisoned his cousin, silenced his ministers, executed suspected traitors, and tightened his grip on the court. Yet none of it stopped the letters from spreading. They multiplied like wildfire, appearing in places where the king could not reach. The nobles carried them in hidden compartments of their robes. Merchants shared, copied passages across distant markets. Even foreign emissaries now quoted words that should have belonged only to him. The kingdom was slipping from his hands, and he could feel it. The final blow to his fragile authority came not from an enemy general, nor from a rival king, but from the very institution that had once legitimized his rule. The church. A powerful archbishop, known for his eloquent sermons and fearless tongue, delivered a sermon that changed everything. Before a crowded congregation, he spoke not the king's name, but of a ruler who had lost the trust of God, who had allowed sin to seep into his heart, who was chained by secrets too shameful to ever be revealed in the light of day. Every listener knew who he meant, and for the first time, the whispers of the letters found voice within the walls of the Holy Church. The king was enraged. His fury was unlike anything his courtiers had ever seen. He smashed goblets, overturned tables, and demanded that the archbishop be seized and punished. Yet even his most loyal advisers hesitated. To lay hands on a man of the cloth so beloved by the people would be suicide. For the king, this hesitation was unbearable. He felt cornered, powerless, and betrayed all over again. But even as he raged, his enemies were plotting their grand move. The coalition that had long been forming in the shadows now saw their chance. A group of nobles, disillusioned generals, and ambitious clerics came together in secret. They had more than fragments now. They had the letters in full dozens of them, enough to ruin the king forever. But they knew that merely whispering them would not be enough. To topple a king, they would have to strike in a way that the entire kingdom could not ignore. And so, they devised a plan. On a day when the king was set to preside over a great public festival, celebrating a recent harvest, they would release the letters not one by one, but all at once. Pamphlets would be distributed in marketplaces, taverns, and city streets. Priests would recite their contents in sermons. Messengers would ride to distant villages carrying copies. The truth, or at least the words that were written, would no longer be hidden in shadows. It would explode into the open, like a fire consuming dry wood. The king, unaware of the exact timing, nevertheless sensed that something terrible was coming. He began to see conspiracies everywhere. He refused to eat unless his food was served by the one servant he still trusted. He refused to leave his chambers unless surrounded by guards. His nights were sleepless, plagued by dreams of faceless enemies holding his letters like weapons. And as his paranoia grew, so too did his cruelty. More arrests, more executions, more displays of power meant to terrify his enemies. But instead of fear, he inspired hatred. When the day of the festival arrived, the city was alive with celebration. Streets were decorated, music echoed through the air, and crowds gathered to see their king. But even as laughter and cheer filled the atmosphere, a darker current moved beneath the surface. As the king rode through the city in his carriage, smiling stiffly at his people, pamphlets began to fall like rain. From windows, from balconies, from hidden hands in the crowd, papers fluttered down, papers covered in the words of the secret letters. At first, the people were confused. They picked up the pages, reading lines aloud to their neighbors, but as more and more letters appeared, as the words spread through the crowd, a murmur grew, a murmur that turned into gasps, then shouts, then outrage. The letters revealed the king's most intimate scandals, affairs with those forbidden, promises of gold to foreign lords, betrayals of allies, mockery of his own people. Every damning word was now in the hands of the very subjects he ruled. The king's carriage came to a halt. He looked out at the sea of faces, once filled with adoration, now twisted with anger and betrayal. People tore the letters into shreds and hurled them at him. Others shouted curses. The air was filled not with music but with chaos. For the first time, the king saw not loyalty but hatred in the eyes of his people. Panic surged through the court. His advisors urged him to retreat to the palace, but even there he found no peace. Crowds gathered outside the gates, demanding answers. Nobles, who had once bowed low, now refused to appear in his presence. The church, emboldened by the letters, began to openly question his right to rule. Even within his guard, whispers of desertion spread. The king was no longer feared, he was despised. Inside the palace, he raged and wept in equal measure. He cursed the letters, cursed the hand that wrote them, cursed the traitors who spread them. But deep down, he knew that he had no defense. Too many of the words were true. Too many of the deeds were real. His enemies had not needed to forge lies. They had only needed to reveal what he had tried so desperately to hide. In those days, the palace became a cage. Guards doubled at every entrance. The king's meals were brought under heavy watch. Ministers avoided him, offering only silence or half-hearted reassurances. Even his own family drifted away, fearful of being associated with his downfall. The man who had once been the center of the kingdom now sat alone in echoing halls, a prisoner of his own secrets. Yet still, he clung to hope. He believed that if he could find the original writer of the letters, if he could root out the hand that had begun this chain of ruin, he might still salvage his throne. He ordered spies across the kingdom, promising gold and titles to anyone who could bring him proof. Dozens were arrested, tortured, interrogated. Some confessed to crimes they had never committed, desperate to end their suffering. But the true author of the letters remained hidden, and with every passing day, the king's grip on reality grew. Weaker one night, historians say, he was seen wandering the palace corridors, clutching a candle and muttering to himself. He whispered fragments of the letters aloud, as if hearing them in his own head. Haunted by the words, some servants claimed he saw shadows of the writer in his chambers, chasing him endlessly through the halls. Others said he screamed into the night, begging the letters to burn, only to find them in his hands again come morning. But while the king was crumbling, his enemies were uniting. The nobles and clergy, once rivals, now stood together in a common cause. They declared that the king, by his sins and betrayals, had forfeited the divine right to rule. They began discussions not of if he would fall, but how. Some urged execution, others exile, still others imprisonment. But all agreed on one thing: the letters had ended his reign. And so, as the third act of this tale closes, the king stood on the edge of ruin. His people despised him. His court had abandoned him. His family had betrayed him. His church had condemned him, and the letters, the cursed letters, were no longer whispers, they were the loudest voice in the kingdom. A voice that declared him unfit to rule. A voice that would decide his fate. The palace that had once been alive with music, feasts, and celebration, was now a hollow shell. Its great halls, once filled with nobles eager to flatter their king, now echoed with silence. The king sat alone on his throne, his crown crooked, his robes unkempt. He looked less like a ruler of men, and more like a ghost, clinging desperately to a fading power. Outside, the city he once commanded was restless. Where once the people shouted his name in celebration, they now cursed it in anger. The letters had spread like wildfire, not only across his kingdom but to neighboring lands. Other rulers now mocked him, quoting his private words as proof of his weakness. His allies turned away, his enemies grew bold, and his kingdom began to fracture. But for the king, the greatest torment was not the armies gathering at his borders, nor the riots in his streets. It was the letters themselves. Every night, he dreamed of them. Every morning, he awoke to new copies, somehow slipped into his chambers. He ordered fires lit across the palace to burn them. Yet no matter how many turned to ash, more appeared. His servants swore they had not placed them. His guards swore they had not allowed them in. And yet, the letters remained haunting him, mocking him, breaking him. The more he tried to resist, the more insane he became. He began to hold audiences where he would read the letters aloud, pausing at certain words, demanding his advisors tell him they were false. But the advisors no longer answered. They sat in silence, their heads bowed, afraid of the man unraveling before them. His paranoia reached its peak when he accused his own blood, his wife, his son, even his daughters, of conspiring against him. He insisted that they, too, were part of the plot, that they had betrayed him to the writer of the letters. His wife, weary and humiliated, refused to appear in public beside him. His children were taken from the palace by distant relatives, fearful for their safety. The king, once surrounded by family, now found himself utterly alone. The coalition against him grew stronger. The nobles and clergy declared him unfit to rule, calling for his abdication. They demanded that he step aside for the good of the realm, offering him a quiet exile in exchange for peace. But the king, consumed by pride and desperation, refused. He would not surrender. He would not step down. He believed that if he held the throne with iron fists, he could still outlast them all. But fate had already sealed his end. The moment came during what should have been a day of ceremony. The king was scheduled to address his people from the palace balcony, hoping to prove he still commanded respect. He dressed in his finest robes, polished his crown, and stood tall as he stepped forward. Below, thousands gathered not in adoration, but in anger. They waved copies of the letters in the air, chanting words of betrayal, demanding justice. The king raised his hand for silence. His voice, once strong and commanding, now trembled as he tried to speak. He declared the letters false, the work of liars and traitors. He swore that his heart had always belonged to his people, that he had never betrayed them. But as he spoke, the crowd erupted in laughter. They shouted the words of the letters back at him, line by line, mocking him with his own confessions. His face turned pale. He tried to shout over them, but his words were lost in the storm of voices. Suddenly, a stone was thrown, then another. The crowd surged forward, pressing against the palace gates. Guards, long unpaid and weary of the king's madness, opened the gates. Instead of defending him, the mob poured inside, filling the halls of the palace. The king, realizing his doom, fled deeper into his chambers, clutching his crown like a lifeline. The mob found him cowering in the throne room, surrounded by scattered letters. His once glorious throne was covered in papers, the very words that had destroyed him. He tried to speak, to defend himself, but his voice was drowned out by the fury of the people. They dragged him from the throne, stripping the crown from his head. Some say he begged for mercy. Others claim he cursed his people with his final breath. But all agree on one thing: his end was pitiful. He was not remembered as a mighty king, but as a broken man undone by his own secrets. The coalition, seeking to restore order, declared his reign finished. His name was struck from official records, his likeness removed from coins and statues. His children were forbidden from ever claiming the throne. And the cursed letters, were preserved not as state secrets, but as public record, so that all might see the truth that had destroyed him. Years later, historians would debate the origins of those letters. Some argued they were the work of a clever scribe with access to the court. Others believed they were penned by the king's own hand, never meant for others to see. A few even whispered that the letters were forged entirely, a brilliant deception, used to topple a tyrant. But in the end, the truth of their origin mattered little. What mattered was their power, the power of words to bring down a throne. And so, the story of the king who was undone by secret letters became a warning, whispered through the ages. It reminded rulers that power built on lies is fragile, that secrets, no matter how deeply buried, will one day rise to the surface. The king had sought to hide his sins, but the letters refused to stay hidden. They became his legacy, his curse, his downfall. In the dim light of history, the image of that king remains. A man seated on a throne of paper, his crown slipping from his head, as the voices of his people rise in anger. His life was not ended by sword or battle, but by words that changed his fate forever.